So this is a makeup class that I missed one of the class last week. So we just try to finish our chapter here. I think that's chapter 11. So we were talking about the how the company actually, as you see here, manage the external stakeholders. Some of the stakeholders that you have to concern is government, customer, employees, the most important external stakeholders. And we are talking about today like government. Government actually impose a lot of regulation, rules, discipline over the companies. So from the company's perspective, the company should know what are those, and understand what kind of, say, government regulations actually impacting the company's business. So the company business should responding it very correctly. So we talked about there are actually two types of government influence on business. One is, as you see here, regulatory influence, and another one is non-regulatory influence, and another one is regulatory influence. So actually both are actually impacting the firm. So, but you have to actually differentiate how those are impacting you or firms in what scale. So we are talking about that one. Actually, also from the researchers' point of view or the industry experts, there are lots of criticism. What is more influential, or whether it is really critical to have lots of regulatory influence over the companies. A lot of, say, criticism for the government's influence, or somebody say that criticizing government should be staying away from the company's activities and operations. So we are just briefly talking about that. But basically, as you see here, the interest of business and the interest of government are not really equal all the time. So that's why two entities actually clash all the time, especially ethically. As you see here, business believe that they should pursue self-interest for the stakeholders. And also, we have already talked about this one in our previous session, that all companies certainly does have their own different ethical management, right? The company does have very different business ethics and practice. So inevitably, because of that difference, inequality of individuals are pretty much obvious and quite natural. So that's the ideas from the companies and business. However, the governments actually totally has the view quite opposite from that business view. As we see that business ethics are widely different among many different companies. However, the government only use a very as you see here, very collective business ethics. And also, rather than allowing the individual self-interest, the government put more value on the collective interest. So that's actually two major difference. So unlike the business, government strongly emphasize maximizing the obligations to follow public goods, which a lot of companies don't like it very much. So we have to understand the two institutions, two organizations that's widely different belief as we see here. So let us have a look at here first, non-regulatory impact on the business. A lot of governments from different countries actually using many plan policies over the companies in indirect way, not direct way. So these two are the major those governments' tool to control and coordinate, sometimes monitor the activities of companies. The first one is industrial policy, and the second one is a privatization. So by using this tool, the policy tool, the company try to influencing the business more indirect way, right? So any of these two are not really imposing a specific rules, regulation over a particular firms, right? So that's why we call this indirect regulation or non-regulatory impact over the companies. Let us have a look at first industrial policy. What is it, and what kind of ideas, how people actually think of the industrial policies impact on the company's operations. Some people say that the government should use more industrial policies, but some other people say that we don't need, the government does not need to use industrial policy. The market will solve all the problems. So the scale of the use of industrial policies are actually quite, proposed quite widely, depending on the government or sometimes depending on the government experts. Let us have a look at industrial policy first. So industrial policy, in Korean we call this a 산업정책, right? So as we see, the industrial policy is nothing but just, as we see here, government measure to sometimes promote the change of industrial structure of economy, or sometimes to prevent some kind of change of the economic structure. So there's any kinds of the government's strategic effort to promote or prevent on the structure of economy. Economy is what I call industrial policy. While the privatization means, it is actually the question of whether giving the power or authority over the control of, whether giving the power or authority to the private firms. Like, as we see, telecommunication, for instance, or national defense. These are very strategically important industry to the nations. So the government determine whether the government control these strategically important industries under the hand of the government or just giving this one to private firms. So deciding that one is the issue of privatization. So privatization is actually giving all those controlling and authority, controlling power and authority to the private sectors. Right? Let us have a look at industrial policy first. I just briefly mentioned about this one in our previous session that especially, I mean, the textbook is actually written by the USA author. So we know that the USA is kind of a country that doesn't want maximum size of industrial policy. It's a kind of a free country, right? Because there used to be a strong reaction to industrial policy all the time in USA. So just before the Bill Clinton administration, somewhere mid-90s, dominant USA presidents actually employed very minimum levels of the industrial policy. Right? So all of the regulation, I mean, not that much strong regulation or rules actually governing the company's activity. However, after the Bill Clinton administration and after September 11 and financial crisis that we went through a lot of as a kind of a global turbulence, USA turning their policy to more kind of a supporting industrial policy. So if you see USA this day, a lot of industrial policy actually, a lot of say mechanisms of indirectly control the company's organization's behavior. So people say that it is necessary. The government should use more and more industrial policy because the USA competitiveness is actually declining. And other countries' governments are using widely lots of industrial policy, then why not USA? So that is actually the people who supporting more usage of the industrial policy propose. And also, every country does have their own important strategic industries. Strategic industries are meaning that particular industry that are very essential to the prosperity of particular countries, like USA, for instance, like say weapon industry, for instance, or like military industry, or car industry, like automobile industry, or so these types of industries are what they call a strategic industries, right? Strategic industry means that the industry that is essential to the prosperity of the country itself. So when government define a particular industry as a strategic one, the government try to impose a intentional policy to protect that industry. So that is kind of an industrial policy. Korea as well, like shipbuilding, for instance, or car, or sometimes what else? What would be the example? Like cars, for instance, or electronics case, maybe. Very important to the growth of Korean economy. So the Korean government indirectly tried to protect this kind of industries against the competing companies from other countries. So every country is anyway design their own particular policy to protect their strategically important industries. So this kind of movements actually supporting the people, supporting those who are arguing that industrial policies should be used widely. So probably in theory or from many textbooks certainly suggest you that the government involvement should be minimum in capitalized society, in democratic society. However, in practice, in real case, you see a lot of government involvement to protect their own people, their own countries. That's pretty much arguments for the industrial policy. I think one of the world-renowned economists is Paul Krugman, who got the Nobel Prize somewhere in 1970s or 90s. I'm not clearly remember, but Professor Paul Krugman introduced new trade theory. If you study the new trade theory in international business, that theory is simply strongly supporting the why government need strong industrial policies. Right. So if you look at a study in new trade policy, the theory is nothing but the fact that the argument that the government should nurture a particular important, what I call it, strategically important industry up to until they mature quite strong enough. Right. So that is actually supporting the industrial policy. Right. The people say minimum involvement of government, but however, like Professor like Paul Krugman say that government should involved until the industry that you think important, mature, grow quite enough, quite competitively in international market. Just like we know that like Switzerland, for instance, watchmaking is world leading in that countries, right? The world best watchmaker. Switzerland is. So how come then Switzerland became the world best watchmaker? According to reflecting the Paul Krugman's ideas, that was possible because the Switzerland government actually protected watchmaking industry in that countries. Like car or electronic goods making industry in Korea. Because why these Korean home, say, electronic or IT industry became so competitive? Simply because government actually help those firms strategically. So government involvement means simply sometimes governments giving strong, say, financial subsidies. If firms are under the financial problem, or if firms are in strong need of financial resource, then the government may help these companies by providing more financial resources. So that is also kind of industrial policy. However, on the other hand, on the other side, the opposite side, people here strongly criticize that the industrial policy is not a good idea, right? It's really bad because it is ultimately reduce the efficiency of the market, right? If the government intentionally helping a particular industries, intentionally, regardless of that particular industry or company's competitiveness, then it is actually, as we see here, stifle the whole industrial competitiveness, right? The strong firm should go that way. The weak firm, less competitive firms should go that way. So in the market, the fair game of the business should go on, so that the market efficiency will improve. So that's actually how people argue against the effectiveness of the industrial policy. It's at the end, the market will less efficient. And another major criticism of the industrial policy is that at the end, a lot of decision makers will decide their firm's business not by the efficiency or business or economic reason, but by the political reasons. That's pretty bad decision, especially when you are dealing with profit making or you have to do something like for the shareholders. So there are the arguments for and arguments against the industrial policy. So actually, we don't really need to judge what is more right or wrong. But what we have to understand at this point is that companies, I mean, the governments are, depending on the country's or the government's economy's condition, they actually use widely their industrial policy case by case. And major argument, if I add more for the arguments against industrial policy, is that at the end, the industrial policy prevents globalization of the world economy. So these are the examples of the government non-regulatory influence. I mean, you may be wondering how governments then impacting your business indirectly. So these are the very major examples, right? Actually, the governments are employers, right? I know that a lot of students today preparing the job for the government, right? So they prepare exam, they prepare interview, and so on. So which means that the governments are really the major employers. So a lot of departments from the government, so they hire many people every year. So by increasing the number of employees or decreasing the number of employees, they're actually impacting the human resource market, which also indirectly impacting your business human resource market. And also, as you see here, because the governments are also the competitors. I mean, we see a lot of state-owned companies like in electronics, in natural resource, and so on. And also the governments own a lot of huge stakes of major companies, which means that government regulates your business, but also governments may be your competitors. Of course, at the same time, they set a standard for a particular procedure. And we talked about this one also. The government makes sure the social security, welfare, and safety of the societies. Right? How the government providing this kind of a fundamental service may also impact your business. So a lot of method of the government's impacting to your business, but again, these are not really impacting your, say, daily operation. But at the end, this non-regulatory measure impact your business to some extent. And probably the most important, certainly, and the powerful non-regulatory government impacts your business is something related to the tax policy as well as the monetary policy. So monetary policy, I mean, which is the major non-regulatory, say, impact to your business. So monetary policy, as you see here, is like the government by controlling, simply say, the volume of money, right? The supply, by controlling the supply of the money, or the interest rate. The government can control the economy, I mean the companies and your operations. Certainly, interest rate, definitely the major impact to your business. And also the government's financial policy, on the other hand, also two major, the key um, a non-regulatory impact to the business. As you see here, the financial policy is like by controlling the government spending. So some year, governments may spend more money for, say, welfare or society. In that case, certainly your business may be more prosperous because the people, public, getting more affluent and richer and more space, room to spend something. So government spending and also government tax revenue. If government, say, increase the tax rate, then certainly the individual, your consumers' expenditure likely to decrease, which also may decrease your revenue and so on. So government spending and the government tax policy, which altogether what I call government financial policy, also impacting your business. So as you see here, the government does have lots of cards to play with, right, to impact your business. So you have to keep an eye on, keep your eye on how these non-regulatory government policies are actually changing. If you are really running your business profitable way. So. What about then government, like more direct regulation on your business? So by giving design a specific regulation, rule, disciplines, or law sometimes, certainly your business impacting quite huge upon that government direct regulation. So. Before we're talking about what are the examples of the government direct regulations, the first thing is that you as a government, say, member, you have to think about what would be the cost and benefit of that government regulatory, non-regulatory, not non-regulatory, but regulatory, more direct impact policy would influence the many companies. So these are the examples as a factor to consider before you actually design and use a regulatory policy or regulatory influence over the business. You have to think about whether your direct regulation will promote more fair treatment, or you have to think about whether your direct regulations have to protect, say, customers, consumers, community, but also what kind of your own burden you may be creating. That you have to also think about. You're supposed to, say, control directly by issuing direct regulation and rules. However, it can be your burden as a government. So you have to think about it. So burden, cost, pretty much the same things. When you actually use a regulation to the government, to the companies, it is not really free. You as a government, you have to think about your own cost of carrying it, undertaking it. So you have to think about it. So what is government direct regulation on the business? So that is the questions. Like establishing kind of a standard, right? Standard or say guideline. So that is direct regulations, right? When you actually produce a product or service, then if governments say that your product should require to meet, say, this standard or this safety requirement. So your product should be over that standard. So that is a direct regulation. Right. So depending on the level of the direct regulation, you may sometimes change your operation sometimes. So government standard or guideline strictly over a particular industry may be direct regulation on the companies. Or if you see here, this day, sometimes government appoint a particular person to a particular position of particular companies. Lots of state-owned companies, for instance. The government just appoints their own people sometimes, persons for the position. So that is also kind of a direct regulation on that particular business. Also, sometimes governments try to say strongly try to govern a particular business or company by using or by taking legal procedures, right? For your product to pass some kind of say safety check, for instance, then by imposing very strict legal procedures, it would be much difficult for your firms to meet that strict legal procedures. So that is also kind of a direct regulation on a particular business. So as you see here, the definition of the, I think of the direct regulation is governments say act of the act of government to governing, directing, or controlling according to government design rules, law, or constitutional authority. Right? So by having that direct regulation, you have to do it. So it is for your firms. So again, as I mentioned earlier, more and more in this capitalized society, a lot of companies, people think that less is better and more. Right? Less government regulation is much better. However, the fact is that we are actually moving quite opposite way. Like financial crisis, Lehman Brothers crisis in 1998 and 2008. And say far before Asian crisis in 1998, a particular problem in particular country actually destroyed the global economy, right? So because of that, a kind of a negative effect caused by a particular country or particular firms, a lot of countries this day are just moving for the more regulation, right? So some people criticize this one as more protectionism. However, that's the fact. Because governments believe that there are lots of sometimes good reasons for imposing strong regulation on the company, especially the global firms. So these are the examples of the benefits and the why the regulations are needed for global firms. Quite powerful reasons you just cannot deny. The first one is, as you see here, by having strong regulation, the government or governments are able to control a monopoly. So as we talked about earlier, the government's goal is equality for all people. So if some company monopolize a particular market, that it's pretty much violating, say, equality of all people. So by doing the regulation job, the government can control a monopoly. No strong particular firms can control the whole market. And more important one is this one, the second one, that controls the negative externality. Externality. What is externalities? I think externalities are very common and very widely used terminology in economics. So externalities means that your behavior, your course of actions actually impacting other economic players negatively without your intentions. So that's what I call externalities, especially negative externalities. So externalities simply means your behavior, action, impacting other players, other entities, whether you like it or not. That can be positive or negative. So we are just talking about here a negative. The common issue this day, especially in Korea, is a diesel engine car, right? As you see, if you are driving a car, you can see that the diesel engine is quite cheap compared to gasoline, right? So we see that Korean government, as well as a lot of other government in other countries, strongly promote diesel cars, right? Save your money, save the money of the consumers. So promoting diesel cars is actually for the benefit of, say, people, public. And some people also thought that the diesel actually free from any pollution. So that was actually the intention of the government and car makers. But what happened? Diesel engine, we saw it as a major source of contamination and air pollution, right? So diesel as a fuel may offer you saving energy or fuel consumption, which is good. However, on the other side, it actually contaminating, polluting the air condition. Right? So that is actually a negative externality. So Korean government this day try to control like big bus, which consume diesel fuel cannot enter, say, into central Seoul, for instance. So that is regulation over the, say, transportation companies, right? So, so that is the bus company never knew their, say, diesel bus actually polluting the air condition. So by having that control by the government can control, as we see here, a negative externality. So that means achieving social goals and also control the excess profits. I mean, recently, like Korean government tried to impose more tax over the big companies, which does have a huge amount of money in their saving account. I mean, we know that the major Korean firms certainly has a lot of cash, right? Simply they don't know where to invest and where to spend. So that's why they just keep saving their money and in their bank account. So government announced that they will charge more tax for those kind of companies. Right? So by charging more tax, they can control a lot of more taxes. And for individual level as well, if you earn more, you have to pay more tax. So kind of that mechanism here. Imposing different rules, regulation, depending on the conditions of the economic player. So that's actually justify why regulation, unequal regulations are sometimes necessary. And excessive competition as well. By having regulations, you can actually remove too much competition, for instance. Like shipbuilding, industry in Korea. So problem there basically because too many companies in that small sectors, right? So government, by their force, to restructure the shipbuilding industry. So it is actually part of reducing some kind of a competition in that industry, kind of a corrective action to reduce competition, what I call it, rationalization. So lots of reasons here as a reason for regulations, but simply all these reasons are simply targeting one goal, to remedy the market failure, right? So types of regulation here you see here. But actually, this is actually from the English textbook, so we rather better off like looking at Korean example. Like when we say direct regulation on the firms, company, there are actually two types of regulations: economic regulation and the social regulation, right? So economic regulation means regulation related to your in more economic way, right? By changing, for instance, like interest rate. Right? By changing interest rate, you can borrow different size of money, different volumes of money, and so on. And sometimes the government set the price ceiling. So whatever product you make, you just cannot charge that price or over. So government set the ceiling of the price, right? So you cannot set the price more than that. Like core, for instance. Still, a lot of consumers in remote area in Korean peninsula use a lot of core for their house, right? So since the coal is actually used for very poor family household, so they are not affordable to pay very high price for that core. So that's why the government set the price. So you, for instance, as a core maker, cannot set higher price than that. So the most strong direct regulation of the government is that government set the price. So no more than that. Or like telecommunication, for instance. You just cannot get into that telecommunication industry even if you are good at that business. So just government control the entry for a particular business. Like telecommunication as an example here, or broadcasting. So some industries which are critical to the life of public, government directly control the entry or even exit. So price, entry, exit. By controlling these three, governments regulate the market and your company, your business. So price, market entry, market exit. So using these tools would be economic regulation. What about then social regulation? So social regulation is also very important direct regulation to your firms. So, so economic regulations are much more focusing on the market, right? Controlling the market, while as you see here, social regulation is like controlling or protecting people. So the focus of the social regulation is not really the market, it is the people, consumers, public. By dealing with people's employment, people's health, people's, say, equal opportunity and people's safety. Right? So government strictly set the guideline rules on people's health, safety, employment, and opportunity. So companies should follow that social regulation. So we are going to talk about this one certainly on Tuesday. But this day requirement for, say, customers, requirement for the employees are really, really strict this day, right? Especially in Korea. The consumerisms are getting stronger, so of course you have to provide the best quality product service to the customers, but that's not enough. You have to also a lot more other obligation to your customers. So you have to understand it, what it is. So we are going to talk about that one. So the point is, because the government's already emphasizing strongly ruling companies with this tough, high standard of social regulation. So economic regulation and social regulation. So you may think that we are going for a globalized society, interrelated, integrated society, more capitalized society. So you may think that less and less regulations are needed, but in fact, each country, governments, actually moving quite opposite way. More regulation, economic side and social side. So that's actually what government tried to expect from their direct regulating the firms. As you see here, more better, safer working condition, more safer products, clean environment, and more benefit to the employees. But one thing for sure that you never miss as a government is the cost, right? If the regulations are such a powerful, then probably all governments try to use wide range of regulation to the firms, but it is not actually, because it is not really free, right? It costs. It is pretty costly job. You as a government to implementing regulation is not really cheap. It is very expensive job. Because why it is so expensive? Because there are a lot of costs actually. The first one is direct cost. And when government regulate the companies, the government actually have to hire more people. They have to set up more departments, more government officials. Then the government have to pay them, right? Salary, right? So who pay them? Your tax, right? So that's direct cost, right? So more regulation is actually coming to you as a more cost. And indirect cost means that since simply direct cost and indirect cost are more related to each other, so more department, more people. So that means more job to do, right? You as a government have more people, right? So that does mean that more people are actually doing the same things, right? More people actually do something in more different ways. So investigating more new field. I mean, the new people, the government actually design new kinds of routines to do the job. Simply indirect cost here means that more job to do. The effectiveness is not really matter here. Simply more people means that people are there not there for just people there just to do more, right? To work more. So a lot more job there to do. So nobody actually work more, right? Anyway, however, more department means more work to do, so which is not quite sometimes inefficient. However, so I think that the most critical problem or cost of regulation is, as you see here, induced cost, right? So induced cost means that kind of cost induced or derived by the regulations. So you never expect this kind of a cost or problem, but it happened because of the regulation. The first one is innovation is destroyed here. Right? I think this is quite important. When the societies does have a lot of regulation, then the innovation levels mostly go down, right? Because regulation means actually the government define do this or do that, right? So that means from the firm's perspective, the company should devote more their resource to satisfy the regulation of the government, not to satisfy the company's, say, creative jobs or desired job and so on, right? So that is actually destroying the innovation. So more regulation actually destroy your innovation power. So because of more regulation, the company cannot invest their money, cannot invest in new area with their new money. Again, regulation means defining area, defining scope, scale of your business. So even if you want to invest something in new area, you just cannot do it if it is actually not in line with the government regulation. And also the problem is that the regulation is supposed to help small firms, but if you see the rare case, there are a lot of, say, adverse effect by the regulation as small firms are receiving, right? Like Korea, for instance, regulation goes like big firms should do something, in this case, with small firms, for instance. So that kind of a policy simply promotes small firms. But because of that regulation, small firms simply losing their market positions. Because the big firms only try to form the partnership with the very competitive and leading small firms. So emerging small firms or new startups, companies, cannot even have a chance because of that regulation. So sometimes small firms negatively affected by the regulation. So these costs are the dark side of the regulation. So you as a government should compare benefits and cost. So just arbitrarily designing regulation and using regulation all the time, anytime, doesn't really help your firms and so on. So that's why in some sector, the government impose a deregulation policy. As you see, deregulation means like removing old regulations. So that's pretty much deregulation, right? If existing regulations are not working well because of lots of costs, especially induced costs, and then the government, say, decide to deregulate, just get rid of the old regulation. So regulation, deregulation. A lot of political say here administrative dilemma by the government, but most of the government's dilemma is still the as I mentioned earlier, the value of the government is equality, right? Strong firm, weak firms, wealthy, the poor, the rich should be receiving kind of, I mean, especially all the people, economic entities, players should be having equal opportunity chance to do something. However, that's what regulation is supposed to do, but in real case, even the regulation you do impose, still the dominant firms are actually dominating the market over the consumers, people, and so on. But as I mentioned earlier, indirect regulations probably increasing. However, direct regulations are decreasing in that sense. Even though, because like cost side, as I mentioned earlier, the innovation is simply destroyed, and even small firms are not really positively affected. So actually, the trend these days are actually moving toward deregulations. So these are some of the examples from the textbook actually. Because of the deregulation in USA, these are the companies in USA actually benefit the most. Like trucking companies, for instance, because of the deregulation, the truck drivers actually drive the cars longer hours, which means that they can make more money, right? I mean, because of the safety issue, like long hours of driving was not really allowed. However, that regulation is actually removed in trucking business. And telecommunications industries as well. We know that a lot of a lot of privatization actually go on. So more competition, more choice of, more consumer choice for their choosing telecommunication service. And in Korea as well, deregulation is actually trend. Like stock market, if you just try to say list your company in stock market, it was very difficult in the past. But this day, quite easy. If you achieve quite meet some sizable outcome, you can easily list it in the stock market. And what are the issue this day? Like the government keeps saying that Korean companies, especially leading ones, should enter into new business area, right? New industry for the country, for the for national economy. So that's why a lot of major firms try to enter new business. But in the past, entering new business was strictly limited because of the regulation. Like big firms cannot enter, say, into this business or that business. That was actually because of lots of regulation. But that kind of regulation simply removed. Like pharmaceutical one, for instance. You know that pharmaceutical industry is not really well developed here in Korea because a lot of regulation. Like animal testing, for instance, is quite important, essential, but not really allowed in Korea. But that regulation also removed. So your new product, drug product, can be tested against animal. And like drone business, for instance. Like in USA, the drone can be used for delivery, right? But in Korea, the drone cannot be used for delivery. It is only used for industrial purpose. So that's why drone business cannot really be the major one in Korea. But that regulation is also removed. So drone can be used for delivery soon, right? So deregulation is also the trend of Korean government. But the dark side of that deregulation in Korea is what? The power of major Korean jabber will be stronger and stronger, right? And the economy would be more polarized. The richer firm getting richer, the poor firm or the smaller firms couldn't have that much chance to take the business opportunity. So that's where the dilemma of the government: regulation, deregulation, direct regulation, indirect regulation, and so on. So the point again, finally, is that the company should, as I mentioned earlier at the beginning, keep your eye on how that regulation is actually changing. Okay. So tomorrow we are going to talk about what aspects of consumer you have to carefully paying attention. So we are going to talk about tomorrow. Okay, thank you.